Following news yesterday of the snap general election, we've come up from Brighton People's Assembly today to talk about Torie Economics with Professor of Economics, John Weeks.
John, thank you very much for seeing me today. It's with key timing really, with the snap general election just being called. In the coming weeks, I'm sure the Tories are going to release a great deal of propaganda about what a good job they've done with the economy over the last 3 to 4 years. What are your thoughts on the propaganda they're going to release, and how accurate might it be?
First thing everyone should realize, I'm sure many of your friends and colleagues do, it's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, we have a terrible economic record. If you go back to May 2010, when George Osborne became Chancellor, I say George Osborne because I think pretty much David Cameron was just a front man. The economic record has been very, very bad. The average rate of growth since has been well below 2%. There were several quarters in which growth was negative. But more important, there's been no transformation of the British economy whatsoever. So the growth of employment, for example, that they make so much of, has been in low-wage, unskilled employment, even though the people getting the employment may have skills. And I'll just give one statistic that will indicate to people exactly how strong the misrepresentation is. Employment in the United Kingdom has grown since 2010, when the Tories came to power. It has grown. But wages have fallen. Now, how can that happen? Because for the most part, the wages of people in employment doesn't fall. What's happened, of course, is that the composition of employment is such that the increase in employment is in cheaper and cheaper labor. We are involved in the race to the bottom. That's where we've been going for the last 7 years.
Interesting, John. Your book that I really can't recommend enough for all our viewers to read, entitled Economics of the 1%, graphically illustrates how the economy is skewed for the richest and most powerful people in the country. How is May's government keeping this dream alive?
I would say Theresa May is, some people say she's incompetent, which she is, I think, but she is not a bad politician in a way. She seems to be fairly successfully overcoming the rule that you can't fool everybody all the time. Well, maybe she doesn't fool everybody, but she seems to fool a lot of people. Because there is this idea that she's not quite as bad as Osborne and Cameron, and she is somehow more flexible. In fact, she's extremely ideological. And if you look at public spending since she came in, and it wasn't that long ago, it was only about 10 months ago, actually public spending has continued to go down. And it's misleading, that's the wrong term to use. It's worse than it appears in the numbers, because not only has spending by the UK central government gone down, local authority spending has gone down. So we've had this strategy that she continues to follow, that Osborne started with, or initiated, and that is making it look like there isn't really austerity because the burden is being put on the local governments. So that's the first thing about May. She's just as much of an austerity prime minister as her predecessor was. The second thing about her is that the idea that, if you will recall, when she first came in, she talked about how she was going to rule in the interests of everyone in working families and similar ideologies and similar rhetoric. In fact, what has happened is that those things which support families and being able to work and look after their children and their children's school. Those things have been cut. So she is, I would say, just as bad. It's hard to say worse because they're all so bad, but she is just as bad as her predecessor, and we see no sign of any improvement or any shift in her policies.
Well, the Tory argument against that would be that the austerity policies that they've put in place is for the benefit of the economy, and we can't continue to spend as much as we are spending on the welfare system and the NHS system. If we continue to do that, the country will be in more debt and we'll be in a worse situation. That's the argument.
Yes. Now, I think that it is extremely unfortunate that in 2015, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls chose to, in effect, endorse that ideology and taking what you might call an austerity-light position. We are fortunate that the current leadership of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, have completely rejected that point of view. Now let's think about it. What's wrong with that? I mean, you really can't spend beyond your means, can you? The debts have to be paid, don't they? And if you run up a deficit and you spend beyond your means, that's going to generate inflation. All of those things are wrong. They're just completely wrong. Governments, can they spend beyond their means? What do you mean by means? You know, a government has the means to raise taxes, that's one thing. But there's a more fundamental issue here. The deficit itself is not a problem. It's the first thing that people should realize. The UK deficit, first of all, it's falling, but even if it wasn't falling, it wasn't a problem when George Osborne came into power and began mismanaging the economy. Very briefly, there's a simple way to see this. In 2010, the UK economy had a deficit because the economy had contracted. Right? In much of the 2000s, before the crisis, the UK economy had been the budget had been very close to balance. Then the international financial crisis hit. When that hit, UK national income began to fall, people's incomes began to fall, taxes began to fall. That was not a problem. That was not a problem being generated by the economy. That was the solution to the problem of a falling economy. And what I mean by that is that the problem of the contracting economy was a result of inadequate spending. Businesses, frightened by the collapse of the international economy, had reduced their expenditure. Consumers, worried about the future, were reducing their purchases of things like automobiles and houses and other durable goods. Of course, you can't stop spending on food, but what are called durable goods, you can delay. You can make your television last longer and so on. Okay. What the economy needed was more spending. And a fall in taxes meant that people were left with more disposable income which they could spend. So actually the growing deficit, which represented a reduction in the money which the government was taking away from people through taxes, was a good thing. George Osborne's mistake, I don't think it was a mistake. I mean, from our point of view, it was a mistake. He saw this, he had an ideological agenda, and it was amazing over a few months how he was able to convince people of his ideological agenda. And his ideological agenda was, I can use this government deficit to shrink the public sector. That the UK economy has a public sector which is designed to reduce poverty and to redistribute income and to make a fair system. And Osborne saw the chance to begin to reduce the ability of the state to do that. And the tool he would use, the ideological tool he would use, was to say, we're spending beyond our means. We cannot afford to do this. He even at one point said, we can't afford to raise taxes either. Maybe we could have once, but we can't now. Those are all just ideological statements. So he began to reduce expenditure, even raise taxes a little bit. You may recall he raised VAT. The effect of that was to make the problem worse. And that's why we still have the deficit. The reason we still have the deficit is because the economy has grown so slowly, taxation has grown slowly, and the growth of the economy has been in low-wage employment, people, many of whom have income so low they can't pay taxes, they are exempted from paying taxes. So as a result of that growth pattern, the economy has grown very, very slowly, taxes have grown very, very slowly, and the deficit persists. Some people say that's a failure. Well, first of all, I don't think it's a failure because it was never a problem. But it's great for the Tories because they can say, we have to keep trying. You know, we tried to solve this problem, but it was much more serious than we thought, and we have to continue cuts, and we can't increase expenditure. So why can't you increase expenditure? Because by not increasing expenditure, parentheses, by not increasing expenditure, we made the economy grow so slowly. The deficit wouldn't contract, and now that the deficit wouldn't get smaller, we can use that deficit for an excuse to cut more.
It's interesting you're saying that about, contracting. I think most of the Western governments took that route of contracting and not spending, but China did the exact opposite and spent, and it led to growth.
Yes, also briefly the United States followed that. If you recall, in 2009, when Obama first became president, he introduced a fiscal stimulus. There were several problems with it. One, it wasn't really large enough. It stopped the contraction of the economy. And the other thing is its emphasis was on cutting taxes rather than on expenditure. And that ended up playing into the hands of his right-wing Republican opponents, because then they could say, all right, now that we've got taxes down, we've got to get expenditure down too. So you're right, China took an expansionary policy. Briefly, several countries did, but then by 2010, the European Union, led by the German government, decided that it was going to reverse the stimulus which had begun in 2009. And you're quite right. Basically in Europe and in the United States after 2010, when the Republicans won back the Congress, you had almost, except for China, except for a few other countries, virtually a global austerity regime. And that's why global growth has been so slow.
Yeah. It's interesting. Another ideology that I think a lot of Western countries, but specifically the UK, is sticking to, in the fact that they're trying to encourage big business. And what they're doing now is encourage big business by saying, actually, you'll be bonkers to pay corporation tax because there's no legal obligation to pay income tax anymore. And come and set up shop in the UK, as they did in Ireland, and this will grow the economy. What are your thoughts on that?
The first thing that people should be aware of is, if you go look at the statistics, you'll find that the inflow of investment from abroad, either from Europe or from anywhere else in the world, the inflow into Britain has been slowing down. So since 2010, when you had all these business-friendly practices, you would have thought if they were going to work, there would have been an increase in investment flowing into the UK. There hasn't been. It's actually, in some years, it's actually been negative. Overall, it's been positive, but it's been falling. That's the first point. The second point is UK business investment is quite low. It remains low. It's recovered some since the great crisis of 2008 through 2010, but it's still low. And one reason that it is low is precisely because of the cutting of corporate taxes. People say, hey, wait a minute, wait a second. How can cutting corporate taxes reduce investment? Well, some of the older people that are saying this might recall that up until Thatcher, the tax laws in Britain were such that it was very unfavorable for businesses to distribute their profits to their shareholders because the taxes on dividends were very high. But if you retained your earnings and invested them, then the tax was relatively low. So if you distribute to the tax holder, to the shareholders, they would be heavily taxed. And if you retained it, you could use it for investment. That was exactly what the tax system was designed to do. It was designed to encourage companies to invest. Okay, so you cut the taxes on dividends, you encourage companies to distribute their earnings, and what happens? They don't invest, of course. The shareholders want to receive dividends, and in productive investment is of relatively little importance to that. If you add to that financial deregulation, such that these big companies are becoming, in effect, financial entities. Well, I mean, you can pick any of them. BP, for example. Most of BP's profits don't come from trading in oil, they come from trading in currencies. You have a lot more currency traders working for BP than you have petroleum engineers. Okay, so we have a new world in which financial organizations, so-called productive organizations have become financial enterprises, and the effect of cutting taxes is to discourage businesses from investing. And Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, particularly John McDonnell, are quite aware of this. As people may know from reading, they are going to raise taxes on businesses. Is this bad for business? Well, it's bad for stockholders. It's bad for people who receive dividends, but it's very good for the rest of us. And if you think the purpose of business is to produce useful things for people, then it's very good for business.
It's interesting. I think people listen to the argument, but then the Tory retort would be, it was a very different world pre-Thatcher. The world has changed; it's globalised more, and when we look at other countries, they have high corporation tax. Do they grow? Or are they stagnant, as the Tories might suggest a country would do if they have high corporation tax?
Well, this is a slightly complicated issue because different countries have different types of tax system, but the simple answer to that is there is no evidence that high corporate taxes discourage growth or low corporate taxes encourage growth. And an obvious example is the United States, where the corporate tax, believe it or not, it's very much against people's perception of the United States. It has a relatively high corporate tax and has relatively high what are called capital gains taxes. That is the tax on increase in the value of property, including fictitious property such as stocks and bonds. And the U.S. has actually grown faster than Britain and faster than most of the European countries, though not that great. The basic problem with growth is austerity. That's what the Tories don't want to talk about. We have a slow-growing economy, and they can't face the real cause. They are the real cause by cutting government expenditure in the context of weak private investment and people going deeply into debt. So you can't have any kind of consumer driven recovery, which would be a bad thing anyway. So what do they argue? They argue, well, the reason we grow slowly is because of these supply side factors. We have to be more favorable to business. We have to bring in foreign investment. We have to do all of those things which make it easier for businesses to make profits. Thus, you make it easier for businesses to make profits. That doesn't lead them to invest. That leads them to take their profits elsewhere, pass them to stockholders. In order to have a productively functioning private sector, we need public policies to foster investment, and the corporate tax rate is one of the tools that you use to do that.
It's interesting you talk about consumer spending, slowing down. Another key ideology for the last 30 years from the Tories is that everyone, if they can, they should try to own their own property, try to get a mortgage, and that in turn will benefit the consumer, the person living in the property, but it will also benefit the economy. I mean, what are your thoughts on
Right. Well, the first thing to note in that argument is a little, you might say, an irony, or a cynic might say hypocrisy. So the Tories want people to take mortgages and buy houses. Now, unless the world has changed a lot, taking a mortgage means going into debt. So what is the household doing? The household is going into debt in order to acquire an asset. Okay, but in normal times, as long as it's not 2008, that asset is going to be worth more than the mortgage you took to acquire that asset. The reason you know that is the bank is not going to give you a mortgage to buy something that's worth less than the loan. Or at least the banks that do that are not going to last very long. And then you say to Philip Hammond or George Osborne, listen, the government has to borrow to invest. And they say, oh, no, that's terrible. That would mean having a deficit. But that's just what they've told households to do. Remember, they are fond of Thatcher, but also Osborne was fond of saying, the government must run itself like a prudent household. Okay, prudent households go into debt, right? They go into debt, they get mortgages. The government, if it's good for a household, then it's good for a government too. Okay, that's the first point. Now, it is, I regret to say, the case that consumer debt in Britain is becoming a very, very serious problem. It has been a very serious problem in the United States for quite a long time, for 30 or 40 years, because of real wages in the United States are now lower than they were at the end of the 1970s, which is quite shocking when you think about it. And the way that U.S. households have dealt with that is by, one aspect has a positive side by more than one wage earner in the family, so that more women going into the labor force, and by going into debt, very seriously into debt. For the most part, that did not occur in Britain until after 2010. And now, as a result of household incomes, say from the bottom half of the income distribution, actually having very little gain at all, in some cases decline, households have gone more and more into debt. And there is excellent work being done on this. There's an economist at Goldsmiths College named Jonah Montgomery who has written extensively on it. And in addition to causing financial distress, it's caused a lot of psychological problems. And it means that no longer is it feasible that the UK economy could be driven by consumer spending to any great extent. And it was never a good idea in any case. Borrowing for households is different from borrowing from governments, and not for the reason most people think. The UK government never has to worry about bankruptcy. The UK government has its own currency. We have the pound. UK government can always borrow from itself. In fact, 30% of the UK public debt is owed to the Bank of England, so it's about owed to the government itself. People cannot borrow from themselves. They have to pay their debts back. A government with its own currency does not have to pay its debts back. But the Tories have flipped this over and said it's bad for government to borrow, it's good for households to borrow.
It's interesting. It looks like consumer debt, and as you're saying, it's out of control and it's heading towards a situation that's potentially worse than 2008. What do you think is going to be the end result?
There are some people, such as the person I mentioned, John Montgomery, and some others who say that we are looking at strong possibility of a something similar to the subprime crisis in the United States. That was a case in which large banking consortia were making loans to very low-income people who, and the banks realized that people would very likely would not be able to service those loans, but because the assets were worth more than the loans, the banks were prepared to make a loan. So in effect, what the banks had in mind is a very cynical strategy. You know, you lend to a very low-income family to buy a house. They can't make the payments. You repossess the house. The house was worth more than the loan. You sell it. You made a profit. Many are saying that we're facing that possibility in Britain now. We have not reached the same level of relative level of consumer debt as in the United States in 2007, 2008. But it is much, much greater than it was in the past. Now, total household debt exceeds total household income. And while that's been true in the United States for decades, that is a relatively new thing in Britain. So I don't want to predict gloom and doom, but there is a serious problem. First, it is conceivable that there could be something like a collapse of household assets in Britain. But more serious is that this will discourage consumer expenditure for decades to come. Because if you have a debt, you reach a point where you reach the limit of what you can borrow. Either the bank tells you that or you decide it yourself. Then you have to start paying back. And paying back a debt is, for the economy as a whole, it's like saving. It's not your saving, it's the bank's saving, but it means part of household income is not going to buy things, but is going to repay debts for past expenditures. And that has a depressing effect on the economy.
We knew this was a situation in 2008 with the crisis back then. What did the Bank of England and the government since do to prevent a similar crash in the coming years? What policies did they put in place to prevent the banks over-lending?
Well, there was a banking reform law I introduced after the crisis. About 4 years ago, a very high official from the Bank of England came and I went to a lecture that he gave, and someone in the audience said he had been critical of the bill, which actually the Bank of England recommended. He said there are loopholes, and it makes it's possible for companies, banks to get around it, and we could conceivably have another crash. And someone said, "Okay, so what is there any way to prevent a banking crisis?" And he said, "This is from someone from the Bank of England, mind you." He said, "The only effective way to prevent a banking crisis is to nationalize the banks," and I think that that's true.
Mm.
You know? Okay, so were the banking regulations effective? No. Without going into more detail than anyone ever wanted to know, the basic problem is when you have free flow of capital between countries, it is almost impossible to limit the borrowing and trading that a bank does. So you might have relatively strict regulation in Britain, which we don't have, but let's say the Labour government comes into power in June, and it seeks to it introduces limitations on bank financial speculation. Those same institutions have branches all over the world, and some of them are in Panama and the Cayman Islands and Barbados and God knows where, Bermuda, Switzerland, where the regulations aren't very strict, and where UK law does not apply. So regulations on banking must be supplemented by limitations on capital flows, and there are some countries that do have limitations on capital flows. They are not, for the most part, the developed countries. Brazil has some limitations. Chile, China, their governments have limitations, but that would be essential to preventing another banking crisis.
It's interesting because to further compound that, we've got more instability coming with the prospect of Brexit. And what are your thoughts about the UK leaving the European Union and going into WTO legislation?
I think here I supported remaining in the European Union. I campaigned for it and organized meetings around it. And in that context, I'm somewhat a minority because I do not think that the economic consequences of Brexit are the most serious. I think by far the more serious consequence of leaving the European Union are workers' rights, human rights, civil rights, which are in the various European Union treaties. Whether I'll say on Monday, I'll be testifying before a committee of the Bundestag on Brexit, and that's the argument I'm going to make. First, let me say why I think that the most important thing are these political factors, and then I'll say why I think that the economic issues are secondary to them. Many of the benefits and rights that we enjoy in Britain were not created, but they were, you might say, accelerated by the European Union. For example, gay and lesbian rights, where British legislation lagged behind European Union legislation. Workers' rights, the European treaties, particularly the one called the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, in effect guarantees the right to organize, in effect guarantees the right to join a trade union. That is not true in UK legislation. The European Union legislation guarantees paid holidays even for part-time people, and a whole other range of benefits. I think that I'll go beyond that, I will say, one of the major motivations of the Leave people, the Brexit people, was to get away from those protections and also the environmental protections. And so we are facing a very perilous situation that if there's a large conservative majority after the election in June, and I certainly hope not, and when Britain pulls out of the European Union, I think we will see an assault on workers' rights, civil rights. And people need to think back just a year when the trade union bill was introduced. You will recall that it had a number of very draconian provisions about the proportion of vote that had to get to strike and all these things. It was opposed in the House of Lords, but also very important in the government dropping some of the provisions was that they were advised by the Attorney General that they were several of those provisions were in violation of European Union law, and that workers could take and unions could take the law to the European Court of Justice and have it struck down. Now that won't be the case. And that is a very dangerous situation. On the economic side, the economic policies of the European Union are very hard to love, let me say. They are completely dysfunctional. The whole Maastricht Treaty, with its limits on deficits, its limits on debt, its strict rule on inflation, all of this is counterproductive and dysfunctional. In addition, the German government has, in effect, imposed an ideology, a mercantilist ideology on the European Union, which is very growth depressing and as well as very undesirable in terms of cooperation among countries. Alongside that, British trade with the European Union has grown slower than trade with outside the European Union. In fact, trade outside since 2000, since the introduction of the euro, trade with countries outside the European Union has grown about twice as fast as within the European Union. In addition, the flows of investment from the European Union into Britain have declined. So I think if you had a Labour government, you could make up the negative impact of leaving the European Union, the economic impact, through public investment and an aggressive industrial policy and more emphasis on the internal UK market. And I think that would allow us to get past or you might say the most critical period in adjustment and transition out of the European Union. But with the current Tory government, that's not going to happen. But one should give discredit where discredit is due. The reason, if the UK economy continues to slow down and there is a unfavorable economic turn in the years in which Brexit is being negotiated, that is a result of British government fiscal policy. It is not the result of leaving the European Union.
Interesting. I mean, all the things we talked about, we face dark days in the economy at the moment unless things change in the election. And a lot of people are thinking, how to change this and reverse the effects that we have not just in the UK but globally. And a lot of people are thinking about going back to the gold standard. What are your thoughts about going back to a gold standard pre-Bretton Woods, a true gold standard?
I think that would be extremely unwise. The way the gold standard was supposed to work was, imagine a very simple case where we don't have any paper money, that all these things are in gold. Mm. The idea was that if a country runs a trade deficit, then it's buying things from other countries that's paying in gold, right? So there's a net outflow of gold. So as a result of net outflow of gold, well, gold's what you're buying and selling things with. Britain has less gold as a result of having a trade deficit. Therefore, either there will be less expenditure or prices will have to come down. So the gold standard was organized such that the way you dealt with trade deficits was you depress the economy. And that is what happened in the 1920s. Also, I think it shows a confusion people have. There's anxiety that, some people say, do you realize that most money in the economy comes from the private sector, that the government doesn't have control of the money supply? Most of it is money generated by banks. Of course it is. I mean, that's what a capitalist money economy is all about. However, the problem is the deregulation of the financial sector. The problem is not whether or not our currency is convertible into gold. You might say, again, giving discredit where discredit is due. The problem lies in having deregulated the financial sector, which can now engage in financial speculation instead of productive investments. So, what would I like to see happen? Well, I would like to see a very strict regulation of the banking sector, combined with limitations on capital flows. And without getting too technical, I would do something like in Chile. In Chile, the government has a law that if you bring money in and out of the country and you hold it there for less than 6 months, then you have to pay a very high tax when it goes out. If you hold it for more than a year, then there is no tax. And the gain for that is it almost completely eliminates speculation. And the instability comes from speculation.
It's interesting. When I say about the gold standard, but there are also people thinking about the bigger picture and criticising capitalism as a whole. And then when the discussion happens, and generally you get a Tory involved, their retort is that capitalism doesn't necessarily work. It doesn't necessarily just produce the wealth. But then you look at the potential alternatives to that, socialism, communism. That can't work because you look at Russia and you envision pictures of old women queuing for 2 days to get a frozen potato. It's just unworkable. What are your thoughts about the problems of capitalism, the potential solutions with socialism and communism?
That line of argument has an aim in debating, which poisoning the well, and the way you poison the well is that you say something that then renders anything your opponent says as dubious, and so what the Tories and their kindred spirits are saying there is any attempt to restrict the operation of a capitalist economy is a step towards communism, where they throw people into gulags and you have to stand in line forever, and your phone is being tapped and so on. This is a fallacious line of argument that has a long history that goes back to the 1920s. Hayek wrote a book called Road to Serfdom, which was basically an attack on Keynes, which essentially made that argument. It's also the idea of that, you take one drink, you're an alcoholic. There are different types of capitalism. At the moment, we are in an ideological period in which the limits to capitalism are being reduced in almost every country. But if we went back about 30 or 40 years, we would see in the Scandinavian countries a very different form of capitalism than we have now in Britain, or in Britain 30, 40 years ago we had a very different form. So we know that capitalist economies can operate very well and perform very well under strict regulations, and can do so in a democratic context. So I think that the argument you summarize, what they're basically saying is they're trying to frighten people from reform. They're saying reform of capitalism will lead to authoritarianism. But the reality is quite the opposite. The failure to reform capitalism will lead to authoritarianism. If we think about the world now, there is a great authoritarian wave sweeping the globe. What we're talking about, Russia, China, the UK, where we're having restrictions on strikes, the United States with Trump. I would say that even on the continent, within the European Union, there are some quite dubious developments, and that's not accidental, because a deregulated or unregulated capitalist system results in inequalities, very serious inequalities. And why do people support a capitalist system? The vast majority support it because they think they're getting something out of it. So in the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s, there was inequality, but workers in the public sector and private sector, pretty much their wages went up at the same rate. Profits went up. Sure, there was a huge differential, but they could say to themselves, there are people a lot richer than I am, but I work hard and things improve for me and I'm getting my share. For decades now, people have been realizing they don't get their share. We've gone from a situation in which the richest 1% in Britain was getting in, say, 1980, when 1979, when Thatcher came in, got a few percentage points, maybe 4% of the national income. Now it's into double figures. How do you manage a system in which people no longer feel they're getting a share? Either you frighten them with some alternative, fictitious alternative, which they fear more than their own poverty, such as immigration. They say, we will protect you against immigration. Or you have to do it through the use of force, or the reduction of democratic rights. I think increasingly we're seeing both. We're seeing a reduction of democratic rights, and we're also seeing the use of immigration as the ideology that will justify the government's existence, even though people are not benefiting economically.
What future do you think a capitalist economy has now, with a world of ever diminishing resources, but not just that, a world that's more with the economy based on data, more than it was 30, 40 years ago when it was on manufacturing?
Well, I'm not a futurologist, so it's,
it's an information economy now, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's changing quickly.
I would make 2 points. One is, I think the environmental issue is very, very serious. I mean, now the U.S. president, who is, let's say that Obama was not that great on environmental issues. He was neutral at best. But now we have someone who is actually encouraging polluters. That's very serious. It's difficult to imagine the consequence of that. You read these dire predictions, and they are pretty dire about what will happen when the ice caps melt and things like that. I think that is very serious. The data-based economy. I think that the most serious thing about that actually is the civil rights implication of it and human rights implication of it. I mean, we're the little did we suspect when we got our first online and started surfing the web, that this would become a mechanism, a very powerful mechanism for social control and for governments to control information and also control people. So on the one hand, I think that growth of data actually strengthens capitalism in the sense that it makes it easier to impose a rather authoritarian state. On the production side, I don't know. I haven't reached a strong position on, or a clear position in my own mind about the impact of that. I will say this about if there's an alternative. Some people will say, because of that, the growth of data and manufacturing is not as important as it used to be. That progressives, the left, we need a different vision. Jeremy Corbyn talking about bringing back jobs and all of this. This is just old-fashioned stuff. I think what we should realize is there are so many things in Britain that we lack that need to be produced. The problem is that many of the I don't want to exaggerate, many of the things we produce are totally dysfunctional. Automobiles, food which is not healthy to eat, and things such as that. But there's so many things that we need with an aging population. Every surgery should have more equipment. There are a number of afflictions, as I know very well, that old people get. Sometimes young people get them, and that require very sophisticated equipment. At the moment, this sophisticated equipment is made on the continent. Some of it's made in Germany, and some of it's made in France. Some of it is made in Switzerland. Why aren't those things made in Britain? I'm not making a narrow nationalist argument. The reason those things aren't made in Britain is because of the strength of the financial sector, which has consistently kept the pound sterling overvalued, discouraged production, and financial capital, which has been quite happy to import anything and make up for it, pay for that, you might say, by exporting financial services, and that is very dysfunctional to the economy. So there are a lot of things we could produce. There are a lot of factories we could have out there making transport equipment, public things for public transport, things for the health services. You go along to the UK hospitals. Every hospital should have the most advanced equipment for checking for eye problems and other things. Even surgery should have them. So I think there is potential for manufacturing, but it would take quite a different kind of government to realize that.
That's interesting. The other thing, blue sky thinking that's been going on is coming from the Green Party as well, and Caroline Lucas saying that perhaps we should have a 4-day working week. What your thoughts on the economy coping with a 4-day working week? How would that work?
Well, of course, I'm now retired, so I have a 0-day working week. But I think this is tied up with a number of other issues, like robots going to take all our jobs. I think that there's no reason, in principle, that we couldn't deal with a 4-day week. The issue is it's a distributive question, right? Because people would have to be paid enough, and that would require taxing business. I think when people think about taxes, the way they should think about it is that businesses pay the taxes. You look at your paycheck and you say, oh my God, I had to pay national health, I had to pay this, I had to pay that. That is I think, incorrect way to look at it. We need a healthy population, we need school people, we need a number of things. How will this be done? This will be paid for out of a surplus generated by our productive system. That same productive system pays wages, and part of what it does is pay wages, part of what it does is it pays for schools and healthcare and so on. What the myth, you might say the fundamental myth or the fundamental lie of the Tories is, if you cut government expenditure, you'll save money. You don't save money. Imagine that you continue to cut the National Health Service and more people take private health insurance. Is that a saving? Of course it's not a saving. It's not a saving because private medicine is more expensive than public medicine. In its delivery, it is less efficient. And all it means is that societies attempt to maintain itself as healthy has been transferred from the public sector to the private sector. There has been no saving, there's been a loss. All right, now, so where are we left with this? I think that we need to view society as like an organism. You know, we're all part of it. We're all part of a health system. We're all part of an education system. It's not something individually. While certainly my health is important to me individually, the point is to maintain a healthy society, and that is not something that you can save on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think we'll finish it there, but it's been fantastic talking to you. And for viewers at home, again, I can't recommend this book enough. Economics of the 1%. It's a real eye-opener.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That's brilliant.